When mountain hermit Jeremiah Colt discovered the beautiful settler Catherine Hartwell trapped beneath her overturned wagon in the frozen Wyoming wilderness of 1864, he thought he was simply saving 2 lives, but their unexpected arrival would shatter 3 years of self-imposed isolation and force him to confront the ghosts that drove him to the peaks. Would this broken man find the courage to protect the family that awakened something he thought was dead forever? Or would the echoes of his past failures doom them all when deadly enemies emerged from the valley below? The frozen mountain air bit at Jeremiah Colt's face like tiny needles as he stepped outside his cabin that morning in 1864. Snow crunched under his worn boots, and his breath came out in white puffs that disappeared into the gray Wyoming sky. He had been living alone on this mountain for 3 long years, and each day felt the same as the last. His rough hands grabbed the old metal bucket from beside his door. The creek water would be ice cold, but he needed it for his morning coffee. Coffee was one of the few things that still brought him joy in this lonely place high above the world. As he walked down the narrow path he had worn into the mountainside, Jeremiah listened to the sounds around him, whined through the pine trees, his own footsteps, and nothing else. No human voices, no laughter, no conversations, just the way he wanted it. The creek babbled over smooth rocks, its water clear and fast-moving. Jeremiah knelt down and dipped his bucket into the stream. The cold water made his fingers ache, but he was used to pain by now. Physical pain was easier to handle than the other kind. The kind that lived in his chest and reminded him why he had come to this mountain in the first place. He stood up slowly, his back stiff from sleeping on the hard wooden bed he had built himself. Everything in his cabin was made by his own hands. The table, the chairs, the bed, even the door. When a man lived alone, he learned to do everything himself or go without. Jeremiah had chosen to learn. The walk back to his cabin took him past his animal traps. These metal devices caught rabbits and other small creatures that he used for food and fur. It was not pleasant work, but it kept him alive through the harsh mountain winters. Today, 2 of his traps held rabbits. Their brown fur would make good mittens, and their meat would fill his stomach for the next few days. As he cleaned the rabbits with his sharp knife, Jeremiah thought about the town far below in the valley. Sometimes, when the wind was just right and the air was still, he could see tiny wisps of smoke rising from the chimneys down there. Real people lived in those houses. They talked to each other every day. They shared meals and stories and problems. They were not alone. But Jeremiah had tried living with people before, and it had ended badly. Very badly. So badly that he had packed everything he owned into a small bag and climbed this mountain, promising himself he would never come down again. Some promises were easier to keep than others. He threw the rabbit bones into the woods for the other animals to find. Nothing was wasted on the mountain. Everything had a purpose, even the scraps. Maybe especially the scraps. Jeremiah understood being a scrap, something left over that nobody wanted but might still be useful somehow. The sun climbed higher in the sky, but it gave no warmth. Winter held the mountain in its icy grip, and spring felt like a fairy tale that happened to other people in other places. Jeremiah chopped wood for his fire, stacking the split logs beside his cabin door. The work made his muscles burn and his hands blister, but it felt good to be tired from something real. Inside his cabin, everything was neat and organized. 1 plate, 1 cup, 1 fork, 1 knife. Why have more when only 1 person lived there? His bed was made with military corners, a habit from his old life that he could not shake. His rifle hung on hooks above the door, cleaned and loaded. A man alone in the wilderness needed to be ready for anything. The walls of his cabin were bare except for one thing, a small mirror made of polished metal. Sometimes Jeremiah looked into it and barely recognized the man staring back. Wild hair, thick beard, eyes that had seen too much. He looked like what he was, a man who had given up on the world and everyone in it. But today, something felt different. As Jeremiah sat by his fire drinking his hot coffee, he could not shake the feeling that change was coming. Maybe it was the way the wind sounded in the trees, or how the clouds moved across the sky, or the strange dream he had the night before about voices calling his name. Whatever it was, it made him restless. He walked to his single window and looked out at the endless white landscape. Mountains stretched in every direction, beautiful and terrible and empty. This was his kingdom now, a kingdom of one, where he made all the rules and answered to nobody. So why did it feel more like a prison than a palace? The day passed slowly, as mountain days always did. Jeremiah mended a hole in his coat, sharpened his knives, and counted his supplies. He had enough food to last until spring, enough wood to keep his fire burning, enough ammunition to protect himself. He had everything a man needed to survive alone. Everything except a reason to want to. As evening shadows grew long across the snow, Jeremiah prepared for another night of silence. He had learned not to expect visitors. Animals sometimes came near his cabin, but people never did. The mountain was too high, too cold, too dangerous for normal folks. Only someone running from something would climb this far from civilization. He was adding wood to his fire when he heard it, a sound that did not belong in his world of wind and wildlife. It was faint and far away, but unmistakable. A human voice calling for help. Jeremiah froze, wondering if his lonely mind was playing tricks on him. But then he heard it again. Clearer this time. Someone was out there in the growing darkness, and they were in trouble. The voice came again, cutting through the mountain air like a knife through silence, and this time Jeremiah was certain it was real. He grabbed his rifle and stepped outside, his boots sliding slightly on the icy porch. The sound had come from the east, down toward the old deer trail that wound through the thick pine forest. No sensible person would be traveling that path in winter, especially not as darkness began to fall across the mountain. But the voice had been desperate, frightened, and definitely female. Jeremiah hesitated for just a moment. 3 years ago, he had promised himself that other people's problems were no longer his concern. He had learned the hard way that trying to help others only led to heartbreak and disaster. But something about that voice, the raw terror in it, made his feet start moving before his brain could stop them. He followed the sound through the trees, his practiced eyes reading the forest even in the dim light. Broken branches marked where someone had pushed through the undergrowth in a hurry. Deep ruts in the snow showed where wagon wheels had carved their way down the steep slope. Whatever was happening, it was happening fast and badly. The scream that split the air next made Jeremiah run. He crashed through the pine thicket, branches tearing at his coat, his rifle ready for whatever danger awaited. What he found in the small clearing ahead stopped him cold. An overturned wagon lay on its side, like a wounded animal, its contents scattered across the trampled snow. Boxes and barrels had spilled everywhere, creating a scene of complete chaos. But it was not the destroyed wagon that caught his attention. It was the young woman kneeling beside it, her hands pressed against the wooden side, as she pushed with all her strength. Her long auburn hair had escaped from under her bonnet and hung in tangled waves around her face. Her dark blue traveling dress was torn and muddy, and her breathing came in quick, panicked gasps. She was probably 20 years old, maybe a little younger, with the kind of determined expression that said she would keep fighting even when everything seemed hopeless. "Please," she said when she saw him, her voice shaking with exhaustion and fear. "My father is trapped underneath. I cannot move it by myself." Jeremiah could hear the man groaning beneath the heavy wagon, his voice weak but alive. Without thinking, he leaned his rifle against a nearby tree and rushed to help. The woman, girl, really, looked at him with eyes the color of storm clouds, full of desperate hope. "On 3, Jeremiah said, positioning himself beside her at the wagon's edge. 1, 2, 3. They pushed together, their combined strength finally shifting the heavy wooden structure enough to free the man trapped beneath. He was older, maybe 50, with gray in his brown hair and the soft hands of someone who worked with books instead of tools. His left leg was bent at a wrong angle, clearly broken, but he was conscious and breathing. "Thank you," the older man whispered, his face pale with pain. "I thought we were going to die out here." "You still might," Jeremiah said honestly. "If we do not get you somewhere warm soon, that leg needs setting, and this storm brewing will make travel impossible." The young woman helped her father sit up against a tree, her movements gentle but efficient. She had clearly done this kind of caring before. "I am Catherine Hartwell," she said to Jeremiah, "and this is my father, Henry. We were traveling to Fort Steele when our guide abandoned us yesterday. He said the weather was turning too dangerous, took half our supplies, and rode off before we could stop him." Jeremiah studied the wagon and the scattered belongings. These were not wealthy people, but they were not poor either. Their clothes were well made but practical, their supplies carefully chosen. They had been planning a long journey, probably to claim land in the growing territories out west. Like so many others, they were chasing the dream of a fresh start in a new place. "What happened here?" he asked. "The wheel caught in a hole disguised by snow," Henry explained, wincing as he tried to move his injured leg. "The whole wagon just tipped over and rolled. I tried to jump clear, but it caught me underneath." Catherine pulled a thick blanket from the scattered supplies and wrapped it around her father's shoulders. "We have been stuck here for hours. I was starting to think nobody would find us before." She trailed off, not wanting to say what they both knew, that a night in the mountains without shelter meant death. Jeremiah looked at the darkening sky and felt snowflakes beginning to fall on his face. The storm he had sensed earlier was arriving right on schedule. In an hour, maybe two, the wind would be howling and the snow would be falling so thick that a person could get lost 10 feet from their own front door. "My cabin is not far," he said finally, "but your father cannot walk with that leg, and we cannot carry him through this terrain." "Then what do we do?" Catherine asked. Jeremiah was quiet for a long moment, thinking. He had spent 3 years avoiding exactly this kind of situation, other people's emergencies becoming his responsibility. He had chosen isolation specifically to escape the complications that came with caring about what happened to strangers. But looking at this young woman trying so hard to be brave while her father suffered, he found his old instincts awakening despite his best efforts to keep them buried. "We make a sled," he said. "Use boards from your wagon and rope from my cabin. It will not be comfortable, but it will get him up the mountain." For the next hour, they worked together in the failing light. Catherine proved to be surprisingly handy with tools, helping him lash wagon boards together while her father offered advice and encouragement despite his obvious pain. As they worked, Jeremiah found himself noticing little things: how Catherine hummed softly under her breath when she concentrated, how she never complained even though her hands were getting cut and cold, how she looked at her father with such fierce protectiveness. When was the last time anyone had looked at Jeremiah like he mattered? When had he last felt useful for something other than survival? The questions made him uncomfortable, so he focused on the task at hand. By the time they had Henry loaded onto the makeshift sled and began the difficult journey up the mountain, the snow was falling steadily and the wind was picking up. Catherine walked beside the sled, one hand on her father's shoulder, while Jeremiah pulled the rope that dragged their improvised rescue device over the rough ground. The climb was exhausting, but eventually the warm glow of his cabin windows appeared through the swirling snow. As they approached his front door, Jeremiah realized that his 3 years of perfect solitude were about to end. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he was bringing other people into his carefully controlled world. What surprised him most was that he was not entirely sorry about it. The storm outside howled like angry wolves, but inside Jeremiah's cabin, something strange was happening. For the first time in 3 years, the wooden walls echoed with voices that weren't his own. "You can't take him down the mountain in this condition," Jeremiah said, looking at Henry Hartwell's swollen leg. The older man lay on Jeremiah's own bed, his face pale but determined. "That bone needs time to heal right, and there's a blizzard coming that'll freeze you solid before you make it halfway to the valley." Catherine stood by the small window, watching snow pile against the glass like nature was trying to bury them alive. Her traveling dress was torn and dirty, but she held herself straight as a pine tree. "We won't be a burden to you, Mr. Colt. We can make do in our wagon. Your wagon's got a busted wheel and no canvas left. You'd be dead by morning." The wind rattled the cabin so hard that dust fell from the ceiling beams. Catherine's shoulders sagged just a little, and Jeremiah saw something break in her eyes. Not her spirit, but her stubborn pride. "How long?" she asked quietly. "Week, maybe 2. Depends on the weather and how fast his leg knits together." Henry tried to sit up, wincing as pain shot through his injured limb. "Catherine, we can't impose on this man. He's got his own life to live." But Jeremiah was already moving around the small space, pulling blankets from a wooden chest, clearing space near the fireplace. "Ain't much of a life," he muttered. "Just me and the mountain don't talk back much." That first night, Jeremiah lay on the floor by the fire, listening to sounds he'd forgotten existed. Catherine's soft breathing as she slept in the corner, Henry's occasional groans when his broken leg bothered him, the gentle rustle of fabric as one of them shifted in their sleep. It was like music he'd stopped hearing years ago, suddenly playing again. The next morning brought 3 feet of fresh snow and wind that could knock a grown man flat. Catherine woke early and started making coffee from Jeremiah's supplies without asking permission. She moved around his kitchen like she belonged there, finding things he'd forgotten he owned. "You don't have much in the way of food," she observed, opening tin after tin to find beans, salt pork, and little else. "Don't need much. Just me." "Well, it's not just you anymore, is it?" She said it with a smile that made Jeremiah's chest feel tight, in a way that had nothing to do with the thin mountain air. When was the last time someone had smiled at him like that? When had anyone looked at him without fear or disgust written across their face? While Catherine tended to her father, Jeremiah found himself watching her work. She had gentle hands but strong ones, the kind that could comfort a hurt person or handle a difficult horse with equal skill. She talked to Henry in a soft voice, telling him stories about the places they'd passed through on their journey west, painting pictures with words of green valleys and rushing streams. "We left Ohio in the spring of 1864, Henry explained when he saw Jeremiah listening. "Catherine convinced me it was time for a fresh start after her mother passed." "What made you pick Wyoming Territory?" Jeremiah asked, surprising himself by caring about the answer. Catherine looked up from changing her father's bandage. "The land agent in Independence said there was good farming country near Fort Steele. Said a man with some education could make something of himself out here." "What kind of education?" "I was a teacher back in Ohio," Henry said with a touch of pride. "Mathematics and literature. Catherine too, before we decided to head west." Jeremiah had never met a real teacher before. The closest thing to learning he'd known was his grandfather's old Bible and the lessons the mountain taught about staying alive. But here was a man who knew about books and numbers, and his daughter who could probably read anything you put in front of her. On the second day, Catherine found Jeremiah's small collection of books tucked away in a corner. Most were practical things, guides to trapping and hunting, a farmer's almanac from 1861. But buried underneath was something different, a slim volume of poetry, its pages yellow and worn from handling. "You read poetry?" she asked, genuine surprise in her voice. Jeremiah felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Found it in a cabin down the mountain. Previous owner left it behind." But that was a lie, and somehow Catherine seemed to know it. The book had belonged to his wife Mary, back when he'd had a wife and a life that made sense. He'd carried it up the mountain 3 years ago along with his grief and shame, reading the same verses over and over until they felt like prayers. "This one's beautiful," Catherine said, opening to a page marked with a pressed wildflower. "Listen to this, Papa." She read aloud in a voice clear as mountain water, something about hope being the thing with feathers that perches in the soul. As her words filled the cabin, Jeremiah felt something stir inside him that he'd thought was dead forever. That evening, while Henry dozed by the fire, Catherine and Jeremiah worked together to prepare supper. She moved around him in the small space like they'd been cooking together for years, handing him things before he asked, seasoning the beans with herbs she'd found in his supplies. "You've been alone up here a long time," she said. It wasn't a question. 3 years come December. That's a long time to go without talking to another person. Jeremiah stirred the pot of beans, watching steam rise into the flickering firelight. Sometimes talking ain't worth the trouble it brings. Catherine was quiet for a moment, studying his face in the orange glow. What kind of trouble? But that was a story Jeremiah wasn't ready to tell. Instead, he changed the subject, asking about her life in Ohio, about the students she'd taught, about the dreams that had brought her family west into the unknown. As they ate by firelight, Henry told stories that made Catherine laugh, and Jeremiah found himself almost smiling at the sound. Her laughter was like water running over stones, natural and musical and somehow healing. When had he last heard genuine joy? When had his cabin felt warm instead of just heated? But even as comfort settled around them like a soft blanket, Jeremiah couldn't shake the feeling that this peace was temporary. Outside, the storm raged with no sign of stopping, and somewhere beyond the snow and wind, the world waited with all its dangers and complications. On the third morning, Catherine found him standing at the window, staring out at the white expanse that surrounded his cabin like a frozen ocean. Worried about something? She asked. Always worried about something. That's how you stay alive up here. She moved to stand beside him, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she'd somehow managed to keep with her through all their troubles. Is that living, though? Just staying alive? The question hung in the air between them like smoke, and Jeremiah realized he didn't have an answer. For 3 years, staying alive had been enough. But now, with voices filling his silence and warmth pushing back the cold, he wondered if maybe there was something more he'd forgotten how to want. Dawn broke gray and ominous on the 4th day, and with it came the sound Jeremiah had been dreading. Horses' hooves crunching through snow, moving up the mountain trail with deadly purpose. He grabbed his rifle and peered through the frost-covered window. 6 riders emerged from the tree line like dark spirits, their breath steaming in the cold air. The man in front sat his horse like he owned the world, and Jeremiah recognized the type immediately. Dangerous, greedy, and used to getting what he wanted through fear. "Catherine," he whispered urgently, "wake your father. We got company, and it ain't the friendly kind." She was awake instantly, her hand moving to shake Henry's shoulder. "What is it?" "The men your father mentioned. They found you." Through the window, they watched the riders spread out in a half-circle around the cabin. The leader was a tall man, with cold eyes, and a smile that never reached them. He wore a heavy coat and expensive boots, the kind of outfit that said he had money and wasn't afraid to spill blood to keep it. "Hello in the cabin," the man called out, his voice carrying easily through the thin mountain air. "Name's Dalton Reed. I'm looking for some folks who went missing from our party down in the valley. You seen anybody come through here recently?" Jeremiah stepped onto his small porch, keeping his rifle ready but not openly threatening. "Haven't seen nobody. Storm's been too bad for traveling." Reed's laugh was sharp as breaking ice. "That's funny, because we followed tracks right up to your door. Fresh tracks, made just a few days ago." He nudged his horse closer, studying Jeremiah's face like he was reading a book. "Now, I'm going to ask you one more time, and I'd appreciate an honest answer. Where are the Hartwells?" Inside the cabin, Catherine pressed herself against the wall near the window, her heart hammering so loud she was sure the men outside could hear it. Her father struggled to sit up despite his broken leg, reaching for the old pistol in his coat pocket. "If those men take us," Henry whispered, "they'll kill us both. I saw things in their ledgers, Catherine. Names of families who paid for land that didn't exist. Graves that shouldn't be there. We're not going anywhere with them," Catherine said fiercely. "Mr. Colt won't let them take us." But even as she said it, she wondered why she was so certain. This mountain man owed them nothing. He'd already done more than most people would, giving them shelter and food when they were desperate. Why should he risk his life for strangers? Outside, Reed was growing impatient. "I can see you're a reasonable man," he told Jeremiah. "So let me explain the situation. The Hartwells stole something that belongs to me. Important papers that could cause problems for my business. All I want is to get those papers back and have a little talk with them about keeping their mouths shut. Like I said, haven't seen them. Then you won't mind if my boys take a look around your property, just to make sure." 2 of the riders started to dismount, but Jeremiah raised his rifle just enough to make his meaning clear. "This is private land, and you ain't been invited." The tension in the air grew thick as mountain mist. Reed's men shifted in their saddles, hands moving toward their weapons. For a long moment, nobody moved or spoke, and Catherine could hear her own pulse drumming in her ears. Then Reed smiled, that cold smile again. "You know what I think? I think you're lying to me. And that makes me wonder what else you might be hiding up here in your little fortress. Wonder all you like. From the bottom of the mountain. See? That's where you're wrong." Reed's voice turned hard as iron. "We ain't leaving until we get what we came for. And if that means we have to tear your cabin apart board by board, well, that's what we'll do." Inside, Catherine watched through a crack in the window as more riders appeared from the trees. 8 men now, all armed, all looking like they'd done this kind of work before. Her hand shook as she realized how outnumbered they were. "Papa," she whispered, "what are we going to do?" Henry's face was grim as winter stone. "That man Reed, he's the one I told you about. The one who's been cheating settlers, selling the same plots of land to 3 or 4 different families. When they show up to claim their property, his men tell them the land was never really for sale, or that they need to pay again for processing fees. But you have proof. I have copies of his ledgers, showing all the false sales and the families who paid but never got their land. That's why we ran, Catherine. That's why he'll never stop hunting us." Outside, Reed had dismounted and was walking slowly toward the cabin, his men flanking him like wolves surrounding prey. Each step crunched in the snow, marking time like a funeral march. "I'll make this simple for you, mountain man," Reed called out. "You give me the Hartwells and their stolen papers, and we ride away peaceful like. You keep playing games, and things get unpleasant for everyone involved." Jeremiah felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. 8 against 1 weren't good odds, especially with 2 people to protect, one of them injured. But there was something else bothering him, something that made his stomach clench with old fear. 3 years ago, he'd faced a similar choice. Different people, different mountain, but the same terrible decision between doing what was right and doing what was safe. That time, he'd chosen safety. That time, he'd let good people die rather than risk his own neck. The memory of that failure burned in his chest like swallowed fire. Mary's face flashed in his mind, the way she'd looked at him in those final moments when she realized he wasn't going to help her, wasn't going to stand up to the men who'd come for her family. "I'll give you until sunset to think it over," Reed announced, stepping back toward his horse. "After that, we start burning buildings until you get more cooperative." As the riders pulled back to the tree line, Jeremiah's hands shook on his rifle. Inside the cabin, Catherine and Henry waited in silence, trusting him to find a way out of this trap. But Jeremiah wasn't sure he had the courage to try. The ghosts of his past whispered that he was a coward, that he'd run when things got dangerous, that he'd let these good people down just like he'd let Mary down 3 years ago. As the sun climbed higher in the gray sky, Jeremiah realized that this day would either redeem him or destroy him. There would be no middle ground, no running away this time. The mountain wind howled around the cabin like the voices of the dead, and Jeremiah wondered if by sunset, his voice might be joining their endless, mournful song. The morning sun painted the cabin walls gold when heavy hoofbeats shattered the peaceful silence. Jeremiah's eyes snapped open at the sound he'd been dreading for days. 6 riders moved up the mountain trail like dark storm clouds against the white snow. Catherine pressed her face to the frost-covered window. Her breath fogged the glass as she watched the men approach. "They found us," she whispered. The lead rider wore a black coat that flapped behind him like wings. His face looked carved from stone, cold and hard. This had to be Dalton Reed, the man her father had warned her about back in Cheyenne. "Stay low," Jeremiah ordered, checking his rifle. His hands moved fast and sure, loading bullets with the skill of a man who'd done this many times before. Henry Hartwell struggled to sit up despite his broken leg. Pain twisted his face, but his voice stayed strong. "I won't hide behind you, son. This fight started because of what I know, and it'll end because of what I can do," Jeremiah replied. Reed's voice boomed across the clearing. "Morning, mountain man. Beautiful day, isn't it? Perfect for settling old business." Through a crack in the door, Jeremiah studied the 6 riders. They'd spread out in a half circle, blocking every escape route down the mountain. Smart men, dangerous men, the kind who killed first and asked questions later. "Don't know what business you think we have," Jeremiah called back. His voice carried clearly in the thin mountain air. Reed laughed, but the sound held no warmth. "See, that's funny, because my business involves a certain Henry Hartwell and his daughter, folks who've been spreading lies about me in Cheyenne." Catherine's hand found Jeremiah's arm. Her fingers trembled, but her grip was fierce. "He's not just after the land deals," she whispered. "Papa discovered something else. Something worse." "What else?" Jeremiah asked without taking his eyes off the riders. "Bodies?" Henry said quietly. 3 families who tried to report Reed to the territorial government. They all disappeared on their way to Fort Laramie. The words hit Jeremiah like a punch to the chest. This wasn't just about cheating settlers. Reed was a killer, and he'd come to add 3 more names to his list. Outside, Reed had dismounted. He walked closer to the cabin, his boots crunching in the snow. "I'm going to make this real simple for you, Colt. Yes, I know your name. Amazing what a man can learn when he puts his mind to it." Jeremiah's blood turned cold. If Reed knew his name, he might know about the past. About the family Jeremiah had failed to protect 3 years ago. "Send out the Hartwells," Reed continued, "and you can go back to your lonely little life up here. Nobody else has to get hurt." "Can't send out folks who aren't here," Jeremiah lied. Reed's smile was like a knife blade. Funny thing about snow, Colt, it holds tracks real well, and those tracks lead right to your door. From inside the cabin, Catherine watched this man she'd known for less than a week prepare to risk everything for her family. Something had changed in Jeremiah during these past days. The broken hermit was gone, replaced by someone who stood straight and tall. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. Jeremiah touched the silver cross hanging around his neck. "Because some mistakes can't be undone, but they can be made right." Reed was losing patience. "I'm done playing games, Mountain Man. You've got exactly 1 minute to think this through." The cabin felt smaller with each passing second. Henry reached for his rifle despite his injured leg. Catherine moved to the back window, checking for another way out. But they all knew the truth. There was nowhere to run. 30 seconds, Reed announced. Jeremiah made his choice. He'd spent 3 years running from his past, hiding in these mountains because he'd been too scared to fight when it mattered. Not this time. This time, he'd stand and face whatever came. He opened the cabin door and stepped outside. The cold mountain air bit his face as he faced 6 armed men. Reed's smile grew wider, thinking he'd won. But something in Jeremiah's eyes made the other riders shift nervously in their saddles. Well, Reed said. "The hermit has some spine after all." "More than you know," Jeremiah replied. His voice carried a new strength, one that came from finally choosing to fight instead of hide. Reed's hand moved toward his gun. "Last chance, Colt. Where are they?" "Right where they belong," Jeremiah answered. "Under my protection." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Everyone knew what came next. Reed's face twisted with anger. His hand closed around his gun handle. But Jeremiah was already moving, diving behind the woodpile as Reed's gun cleared leather. The first shot split the morning, quiet like thunder. Splinters of wood exploded around Jeremiah as bullets tore into his makeshift cover. The woodpile wouldn't protect him for long, but it bought him precious seconds to think. 6 men with guns against 1. The math wasn't good. Inside the cabin, Catherine grabbed her father's rifle. Her hands shook, but her voice stayed steady. "I can shoot," she told Henry. "Papa taught me when we left Missouri." "These aren't rabbits, daughter," Henry warned. But he saw the determination in her eyes, the same fire that had carried their family west against all odds. Reed's voice cut through the gunfire. "Burn them out! Wilson, get around back! Davis, watch that window!" Jeremiah counted the shots. Reed had 5 bullets left. The man called Wilson was moving toward the cabin's rear. Time was running out fast. From his hiding spot, Jeremiah could see the whole clearing. The riders had spread out just like he'd expected. But they'd made one mistake. They thought he was just a scared hermit who'd gotten lucky once. They didn't know about the 3 years he'd spent hunting in these mountains, learning every rock and tree. A burning stick landed near the woodpile. Then another. Smoke began to rise from the dry wood. Reed meant to burn him out, force him into the open where 6 guns waited. "Can't hide forever, Colt," Reed shouted. "Come out now and I'll make it quick." Instead of answering, Jeremiah moved. He rolled away from the burning woodpile and came up running toward a cluster of pine trees. Bullets whined past his ears, but none found their mark. From the trees, he had a clear shot at Wilson, who was creeping toward the cabin's back door. Jeremiah's rifle spoke once. Wilson spun and fell, clutching his shoulder. 5 men left. "He got Wilson!" someone yelled. "Shut up and keep shooting," Reed snarled. But Jeremiah heard something else in Reed's voice now. Uncertainty. Fear. The man who'd seemed so confident was starting to worry. Catherine appeared at the cabin window, her rifle ready. She'd torn a strip from her dress and tied back her hair to keep it out of her eyes. This wasn't the frightened girl who'd fallen from the wagon days ago. This was a woman defending her home. "Papa, they're trying to get around to the root cellar," she called. Henry nodded. The root cellar had a tunnel that led to the creek bed. If Reed's men found it, they could get inside without being seen. "I'm going out there," Catherine announced. "Like hell you are," Henry growled. "They don't know I can shoot," Catherine argued. "That's an advantage we can't waste." Before Henry could stop her, Catherine slipped out the back door. She moved like a shadow between the trees, her dress dark against the white snow. Reed's men were watching Jeremiah, not expecting danger from behind. The man called Davis never saw her coming. Catherine's rifle butt caught him behind the ear, and he dropped like a stone. 4 men left, and now Reed was really worried. Where are they? Reed demanded, spinning in circles. Davis, Wilson, answer me. From the pine trees, Jeremiah called out. Seems like your odds are getting worse, Reed. You think this changes anything? Reed shot back. I've got enough men to finish this. Maybe, Jeremiah agreed. But I've got something you don't. What's that? Something worth fighting for. The words seemed to echo off the mountain peaks. Reed's remaining men looked at each other nervously. This wasn't going the way they'd planned. The easy job had turned into a real fight. Jeremiah used their confusion to move again. He slipped from tree to tree like a ghost, getting closer to the cabin. Reed was starting to panic, shooting at shadows and wasting ammunition. Stand still and fight like a man, Reed screamed. I am fighting, Jeremiah replied from somewhere in the trees. Just not like a fool. Catherine had circled around to a rock outcrop that overlooked the clearing. From there, she could see everything. Reed had 2 men left besides himself. They were bunched together now, scared and confused. She thought about the families Reed had murdered. Men and women just like her and Papa. People who'd only wanted a fair chance at a new life. Her finger tightened on the trigger. Henry watched from the cabin window, his heart pounding. His daughter was out there facing killers, and his broken leg kept him from helping. But he'd raised her right. She had steel in her spine and fire in her heart. A new sound drifted across the clearing. Hoofbeats from down the mountain trail. Lots of them. Someone was coming, and coming fast. Reed heard it too. His face went pale as he recognized the sound of many horses. No, he whispered. They can't be here yet. Through the trees came a dozen riders wearing the blue uniforms of the Territorial Army. At their head rode a man with silver hair and captain's bars on his shoulders. They'd been riding hard, their horses lathered with sweat. Dalton Reed, the captain called. You're under arrest for murder, fraud, and conspiracy. Reed's last 2 men threw down their guns and raised their hands. They knew when a fight was over, but Reed himself wasn't finished yet. His face twisted with rage as he raised his rifle toward the cabin. If I can't have them, nobody can, he snarled. That's when Catherine's rifle spoke from the rocks above. Reed spun around, his shot going wild into the sky. He stared up at her in amazement, then collapsed into the snow. The fight was over. The morning sun painted gold streaks across the cabin walls. When Catherine found something that changed everything. Hidden beneath loose floorboards near Jeremiah's bed lay a small wooden box, its contents spilling out like secrets finally set free. Papa, look at this, she whispered, holding up a faded photograph of a woman and small child. The woman's face bore a striking resemblance to Catherine herself, while the child's eyes held the same gentle sadness she'd seen in Jeremiah's quiet moments. Henry hobbled over on his makeshift crutch, studying the image with growing understanding. That's his family, he said softly. The ones he lost. More items emerged from the box, a child's wooden horse, carved with loving detail, a wedding ring wrapped in yellowed cloth, and letters written in a woman's careful hand. Catherine's fingers trembled as she read the final letter, dated 3 years earlier, describing their plans to join Jeremiah at his mountain retreat before the winter snows arrived. They never made it, Catherine realized, her voice barely above a whisper. They died trying to reach him. The sound of approaching footsteps sent them scrambling to replace the items, but Jeremiah appeared in the doorway before they could close the box completely. His face went white as granite when he saw what they'd discovered. You had no right, he said, his voice raw with old pain. We didn't mean to, Catherine began, but he turned away, his shoulders shaking with barely controlled emotion. Their names were Mary and Samuel, he said finally, staring out the frost-covered window. My wife and son. They were coming here for Christmas in 1861, but a blizzard caught them in Devil's Canyon. Search parties found them 3 months later, frozen under an overturned supply wagon. The silence stretched like a taut rope between them. Outside, wind whistled through the pines, carrying the sound of distant wolves calling to each other across the empty spaces. I should have gone to fetch them myself, Jeremiah continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. Should have known better than to let them travel alone in winter. But I was too proud, too stubborn, thought they could handle the journey just fine. Catherine stepped closer, her hand reaching toward his arm before stopping short. You couldn't have known what would happen. Could have tried harder to stop them. Could have made that cabin warmer, more welcoming, so they wouldn't have been so eager to leave town. His laugh was bitter as winter wind. Instead, I was up here feeling sorry for myself, counting the days until they arrived. Henry cleared his throat gently. Son, guilt is a heavy burden to carry alone, but sometimes the best way to honor the dead is by helping the living. That's what Mary used to say, Jeremiah replied, touching the wooden cross around his neck. She always saw the good in people, even when they couldn't see it themselves. Samuel was the same way, only 8 years old. But he'd give his last piece of bread to a hungry dog. The morning stretched on as Jeremiah shared more memories, his voice growing warmer with each story. He told them about Mary's terrible cooking and wonderful singing, about Samuel's collection of interesting rocks, and his dream of becoming a mountain guide like his papa. They would have liked you, he said to Catherine, surprising himself with the admission. Mary had the same fire in her eyes when she set her mind to something, and Samuel would have followed you around asking 100 questions about everything you did. As the day wore on, something shifted in the cabin's atmosphere. The ghosts that had haunted these walls for 3 years seemed to grow quieter, as if listening to the sound of living voices with approval rather than accusation. But their peaceful moments shattered when Henry spotted movement through the window. Someone's coming up the trail, he announced, reaching for his rifle. 3 riders moving fast. Jeremiah's transformation was immediate and complete. The grieving widower disappeared, replaced by the hard-eyed survivor who'd learned to trust no one. Get away from the windows, he commanded, checking his weapons with practiced efficiency. Through the frosted glass, they watched 3 figures approach not Reed's men, but strangers wearing the blue uniforms of territorial law. The lead rider carried a flag of truce, but Jeremiah had learned long ago that flags could lie as easily as words. Jeremiah Colt, the officer called out. We're here on official business. Need to speak with you about some folks named Hartwell. Catherine's blood turned cold. Had Reed's influence reached even the territorial authorities? Were they about to be arrested as criminals? Or worse? What kind of business? Jeremiah shouted back, his rifle trained on the lead rider. The good kind, if you'll let us explain. We've got news about those land grabbers you helped capture. Turns out there's more to their story than anyone realized. The officer's next words would either save them or doom them all. And in that moment of terrible uncertainty, Catherine realized she'd rather face whatever came next, standing beside this broken, brave man, than flee into an uncertain future without him. The lead officer removed his hat as he stepped into the cabin, revealing graying hair and kind eyes that had seen too much hardship but hadn't lost their compassion. Name's Captain William Hayes, Territorial Marshal Service. I've got some news that might interest you folks. Catherine gripped her father's arm, preparing for the worst, but Hayes's first words brought unexpected relief. Reed and his gang confessed to everything: the land fraud, the murders, even burning out families who tried to resist their schemes. Turns out, they've been operating across 3 territories for the past 5 years, stealing claims and selling them to multiple buyers. What's that got to do with us? Jeremiah asked, though his rifle had lowered slightly. Hayes smiled, pulling a folded document from his coat. Well, Mr. Colt, seems like the territorial governor is mighty grateful for your help in bringing these criminals to justice. So grateful, in fact, that he's offering you a proposition. The document crackled as Hayes spread it across the rough wooden table. Catherine leaned forward, her heart racing as she read the official seal and flowing script. The territory needs good men in positions of authority, Hayes continued. Men who aren't afraid to stand up for what's right, even when it's dangerous. There's a marshal's badge waiting for you in Cheyenne if you want it. Jeremiah stared at the papers as if they were written in a foreign language. I'm not lawman material, Captain. I'm just a mountain man who got lucky. Lucky men don't track down 6 armed criminals and bring them in without losing a single innocent life, Hayes replied firmly. That takes skill, courage, and something even rarer, the kind of character that puts other people's safety before your own comfort. Catherine felt her breath catch in her throat. A marshal's position would mean leaving the mountain, joining civilization, becoming part of the world again. It was everything she'd hoped for and everything she feared Jeremiah would reject. There's more, Hayes added, producing another document. The families that Reed cheated out of their claims, they're getting their land back, plus compensation for their losses. That includes prime farmland near Fort Steele, if you're interested in settling down somewhere. Henry hobbled forward, studying the papers with growing excitement. Catherine, look at this description. It's got water rights, timber access, and soil that sounds perfect for the crops we talked about growing. But Catherine's attention remained fixed on Jeremiah, watching the internal battle play out across his weathered features. She could see him weighing his old life of isolation against an uncertain future filled with responsibility and human connection. I need time to think, he said finally. Of course, Hayes replied, gathering the documents, but don't take too long. Territory's growing fast, and good men are hard to find. I'll be in Fort Steele for 3 days if you want to discuss the details. After the officers departed, silence settled over the cabin like fresh snow. Catherine found herself afraid to speak, afraid that the wrong words might tip Jeremiah toward choosing solitude over the chance at a new life. You should take it, Henry said quietly, breaking the tension. It's a good offer, and this territory needs men like you. Men like me? Jeremiah's voice carried old bitterness. I couldn't even protect my own family. What makes you think I could protect anyone else? Catherine felt something snap inside her chest, a dam of patience finally breaking. Because you already did protect us. You risked your life for complete strangers, stood up to armed criminals, and never asked for anything in return. That was different? No, it wasn't. She stood, facing him with fierce determination. You think Mary and Samuel would want you to spend the rest of your life hiding in this cabin, punishing yourself for something that wasn't your fault? Jeremiah recoiled as if she'd struck him. You don't know what they'd want. I know what any mother and child would want for someone they loved. Catherine shot back. They'd want you to live, really live, not just survive. They'd want you to use your strength to help other people, to make sure other families don't suffer the way yours did. The argument that followed was fierce but necessary. Voices raised, and emotions finally freed from the careful politeness that had constrained them. Henry watched from his chair, occasionally adding his own thoughts, but mostly letting the two younger people work through their fears and hopes together. As the sun began to set, painting the cabin walls with soft orange light, Jeremiah finally spoke the words that would change everything. I'll take the marshal's job, he said quietly, but only if you'll both come with me. I can't face that kind of responsibility alone, and I don't want to try. Catherine's smile was brighter than any sunrise she'd ever seen. Are you asking us to be your family, Jeremiah Colt? I suppose I am, he replied, his own smile tentative but genuine. If you'll have a broken-down mountain man who's still learning how to trust people again, we'll have you, Henry said warmly. On one condition, you stop calling yourself broken. A man who can love deeply enough to grieve for 3 years, then find the courage to love again, isn't broken. He's just human. As they began planning their journey down from the mountain, Catherine felt the last pieces of her heart settle into place. She'd come to the Wyoming territory looking for land and found something far more valuable, a family forged not by blood but by choice, strengthened by shared hardship and sealed by mutual respect. The mountain had given them shelter when they needed it most, but now it was time to carry its lessons down into the world below, where other people needed the kind of protection and compassion they'd learned to give each other. Outside, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. And somewhere in the distance, wolves sang their ancient songs of survival and hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, and new opportunities to prove that even the most wounded hearts could heal when surrounded by love. But tonight, they were simply 3 people who'd found each other in the wilderness and chosen to build something beautiful from the broken pieces of their separate lives.